This video is to discuss in greater detail some of the devices that you can do to examine the plot of a short story, novel, essay, etc. The reading that you did in packets 1 and 2 touched on this, as plot is one of the important elements of fiction. But I wanted to give you a couple of additional ways that you can look at plot and start to analyze it. So there are many, many ways that you can do this, and some of you have probably been taught a few of these in some of your English classes in the past. The three most often used devices, plot devices, are the inverted check mark, so the inverted check mark, A, B, D, C, E, and we'll talk about what each of those letters stand for in just a minute. And then my favorite, and one that you maybe have not seen before, but that I think works really well, is the fish model. So first, the inverted check mark. This is the one that you're probably most familiar with. It looks like this. We start with the rising action and the development. The top here is the climax, and then you have the resolution or conclusion. Okay, so again, this is probably the one you're most familiar with, and this does fit really well with stories that have a very clear climax. Like action adventure stories, movies that you watch that have like a strong action adventure theme often fit into this really well. So if you're thinking about, I don't know, like I watched Taken this morning, right? So if you're thinking about a movie like Taken, we start down here where something happens, right? Liam Neeson's daughter gets taken. So then you have the rising action. He's searching for people, he's shooting people, he's looking for his daughter, he's finding out information. And then the climax here is where he finally finds her, he shoots the last bad guy. And then we have a little bit of film after that, which would be like the resolution. Usually that's just going to be a couple minutes of wrapping up, right? This form of plot, I suspect you're most familiar with. And it does work well for those kind of stories. However, a lot of stories that you read, especially literary fiction, isn't going to have this really clear and easy to follow arc climax. So models like the fish model and even ABDCE fit a little bit better. So ABDCE, those letters stands for action. So your story would start with some sort of action happening, something that is going to propel the story forward. So that's the A. The B is background. So something happens, and then you get some background onto why it happened, what led to it, etc. D is development. So that's like the rising action here, right? So you're learning more, the story is developing, things are happening. C then is climax, and E is ending, right? So A, B, D, C, E, and the inverted check mark are very similar, except for this model gives you a little bit more room for that background and development than the inverted check mark model does. Okay. So the last one that I'm going to talk about, if I can get some space here, is the fish. Okay. And as I said, the fish is my favorite model because I think it works the best with stories like the ones that you'll be reading for class, where there's not necessarily a lot of action, a really distinct climax, but there is what we're going to call a top story and a bottom story. Okay, so the way that you would start to use the fish model would be to make a fish, right? And I actually don't like my fish. I'm gonna draw him again, maybe. All right. Oop. So you make your fish model here, your little fish, and then you imagine the top of the fish is going to be your top story. The bottom of the fish is going to be the bottom story. Okay, so the top story is what's above the water, right? This is what's on the surface. This is the plot points that you can see easily. The bottom story, though, is like the deeper meaning, the bigger picture. What the author wants you to take away from this story beyond just what happens, right? So, for instance, if you think about, let's say, Harry Potter, right? Let's think about the first Harry Potter. So the top story is going to be boy goes to Hogwarts, saves the day, right? And then you'd have all these points here along the top story that would be your plot points, like Harry gets his letter, Harry meets Hagrid, Harry meets Dumbledore, Harry is attacked, Harry faces the bad guy at the end, faces Voldemort at the end, right? So these are going to be your plot points. So this is what happens in Harry Potter, but it's not what the story is necessarily really about, right? What it's really about is the bottom story. So that might be something like finding a home. The idea that different is good. The idea that family can be anyone, right? You don't have to necessarily have a blood relation to be a family member. So that's the deeper meaning, that's the bigger picture. And in a really great story, all of these little plot points are going to be giving you clues to what the bigger picture is. Now, so as in any good device that's going to analyze a plot, you are still going to have a climax, but the climax is a little different in this model. Because as you see, it's not this high arc where the top point is the climax, but it's this right here where the top story and the bottom story meet. Right? So some event happens in the top story that helps you understand what the bottom story is. In Harry Potter, it might be that end scene where Harry fights Voldemort, right? And the Dumbledore's bird comes and saves him because he needed help. Then, instead of the end of the little check mark falling away, what you see is that the that the bottom story comes up on top, right? And that the top story goes down and falls away. So you learn what's always meant to be important from the beginning, because that's what ends up on top, right? Which is the bottom story, the big picture. So I hope that this makes sense to you. As I've said in my bio, I'm a writer, and I learned this model in a writing class where we were being taught how to start to develop our own stories. But I think it works just as well when you're analyzing the writing of others, because it reminds you that we don't want to just summarize and say, okay, so here's what happens in this story. But we want to look a little bit deeper and think about what the bigger picture is. This model is very similar to another device that analyzes plot, which is Hemingway's iceberg. Hemingway's iceberg is a similar model, as I said, and when you draw it, you draw something like this, right? This is an iceberg. And what it's pointing to is that there's very little on the surface. There's very little of an iceberg on the surface, most of that iceberg is below the surface, as in this model. So Hemingway believed that you would give the readers just enough, right? Just this little bit here on the surface. And then it would be up to them to figure out and to dig deeper and understand what's the bigger picture, what's below the surface. This is similar to the fish, except you see that this model lends itself to this idea of creating these little hooks from top to the bottom. And there's more on the surface than the iceberg technique. But it's similar in this top story, bottom story kind of way. You can see Hemingway's iceberg technique really being used in his story that we're reading for class, which is Hills Like White Elephants. And in that story, you'll notice that there's very little information given about what's happening in that story. You sort of have to read between the lines. You have to take the clues that you're given and figure out what the bigger picture is. And if you look closely at that story, you can see how it really fits into this model. Okay, so those are your models of plot. The inverted check mark, A, B, D, C, E, the fish model, and then I threw Hemingway's iceberg in there just as an additional way to look at plot and as a way to really be thinking about Hills Like White Elephants when you read that for class. These devices are really important, and you're definitely going to want to remember this as you're reading and think about how the stories that you've looked at can fit into this. So for example, maybe go back now and think about how A and P could fit into this model. I think that you would be able to do that pretty easily. This will be on your midterm exam. You'll be asked to name the models and also to be able to use the models. So again, it's really important that you're able to understand these, remember them, and keep them in mind.